empowering specifically young people to understand their rights in the intimate places, to own their rights in their intimate relationships, and to shed the shame that we have gifted them through our own distorted thinking about these most intimate of relationships that should be loving, should be dignifying, and should be honouring, but so often are places of denigration, of exploitation, and of violence. And of course, here I am talking about our identities as sexual beings, and I'm trying to point to the problem of old people for young people in regards to this question of empowerment in the space of sexual intimacy. Too often, well, more than too often, in any place where we seek to suppress the provision of information, of fact, of skills, indeed of education, no matter how young. That's a baby, huh? It's a peacock. Oh, that's well, you know, I could go down there, but I shan't. No matter, aren't you? Yeah. Oh, come on, you're inviting me now, and that's not helpful. Get me back on the straight and narrow path of being a proper UN official. No matter how young or old, there can be no excuse for silencing this part of us, which is as natural as breathing, as essential as eating, and as critical as shelter. And that's why today we're so thrilled to have Karin, Avni, and Makita join us to talk about and to launch this next edition of the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education here as part of the Human Rights Council. It's our purpose to explain to you what's in that guidance and the evidence base for it. It's our purpose to encourage the Human Rights Council to understand this is its business. And it's our purpose here ultimately to ensure that young people, children, are empowered with the information and assets that only comprehensive sexuality education can provide. So I'm going to turn to Karin for the first go. Karin is with UNESCO. She is a specialist working on health and education with UNESCO in Paris. And Karin, you've been a fantastic partner for us in this work. It's something that across the UN system a number of agencies have contributed to. We're so thrilled to have UNESCO's leadership, and thank you very much for being with us, and my apologies. Karin, over to you. Thank you.
Shall I use this one?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much, Sexual Rights Initiative, for inviting me. On behalf of UNESCO, I'm very happy and pleased to be able to present to you what is the technical guidance, really. I have a quick PowerPoint presentation just to walk you through a couple of the sort of technical elements of what it is. Can you hear me well, by the way? Is it fine? Great. Okay, so the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education is a technical guidance that is developed by UNESCO in partnership with UNAIDS, UNFPA, UNICEF, UNWomen, and WHO. So it's been a very long process in terms of what is it that needs to be included, what is it that UN agencies can recommend to be incorporated and to be updated, because this is an update from the previous technical guidance that was released in 2009. Can I have the next slide, please? Can you see? It's a bit texty, but so the core purposes is that it is a technical tool for member states and for key stakeholders in order to know how to identify the characteristics of effective comprehensive sexuality programs, and also recommendations on essential topics and also specific objectives that should be covered in comprehensive sexuality education for different age groups. So you have different content issues related to different age groups, same as all kinds of educational issues that you learn about certain things in certain ages. You have also outlined approaches for planning, delivering, and monitoring of effective comprehensive sexuality education. So these are the sort of three components of what's within the technical guidance, and these are voluntary guidance and recommendations on behalf of the UN partners to member states in order to improve, to reflect on what's included in their own national curricula as support for them when they further develop their own national recommendations. Could I have the next one? So why is it important to have a technical guidance? Well, there are a couple of misunderstandings sometimes. Sometimes there are insecurities about what is it really that comprehensive sexuality would entail, and how would I transfer that to knowledge, and how can I talk about this in my school? So in order for ministries of education, for teachers, and for other key stakeholders who are working around and in the educational sector, this is a support for them. So it's a technical support to enable national authorities to design comprehensive and relevant curricula and programs in their own countries. And it's also to support stakeholders with recommendations, updated recommendations on what can we do to support young people to the very best extent that we can within the school setting and outside, to equip them with knowledge and with skills so they can make responsible choices for their lives. And also to look upon what are the actual misconceptions and myths around comprehensive sexuality education, because there are a couple of concerns sometimes that it's important to address and unpack and to understand what is comprehensive sexuality education in practice. I mentioned to you, thank you, briefly that so who is this guidance directed to? And it's of course to governments and to ministries of education, health and gender equality, among many others, who are dealing with ensuring that young people have the knowledge and support that they need in their development. It's for non-governmental organizations, but also for youth workers and young people who can use this document to look upon the latest facts, the evidence reviews, and also to key recommendations that UN partners would recommend countries to include and to reflect upon in their own national curricula. Next, please. So if we would compare the old one, which was released in 2009, and the new one, what do you see that will be new when the new update? So we have, of course, conducted rigorous research and evidence reviews in terms of what's working, what do we know about the outcomes of comprehensive sexuality education, what kind of effects do we see, and when we assess the outcomes of comprehensive sexuality education. And this has been done at a global level, at a national level, with experts and ministries and researchers across the world. We have key concepts and topics and learning objectives that have been somewhat more enhanced and expanded compared to the previous ones, so they will be more comprehensive. They will include more content issues. And a deeper understanding that comprehensive sexuality education is really to support young people in a healthy development and overall well-being. And this is also a little bit of a new tone to look upon young people's rights and young people's, how can we support young people to have a gender equal life in practice? What would they need in terms of discussions at schools? What kind of supportive environment do we need to create in order to fulfill those promises, but more from a positive approach. So the previous guidance in 2009 was very much in that time focused on HIV prevention. So comprehensive sexuality, of course, is an important, crucial topic to address HIV prevention within, and that's also something that I will go into a little bit later on. But this is a bit broader perspective in terms of ensuring young people's well-being, not only in terms of preventing HIV, but broadly to prevent ill health more broadly, or to really support well-being in their life, the positive side of sexuality and having relationships that are supportive and healthy with mutual respect in between each other. So it goes beyond the risk and disease focus. It's reaffirming the position of comprehensive sexuality education within the framework of human rights and gender equality. Of course, it's part of the right to education, the right to information, and the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And comprehensive sexuality education is a tool to achieve that in practice also for young people. It's also set out in the new context of new global and national and regional commitments when it comes to young people's health and well-being. So you see the symbols of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. There are couple of them that would be more relevant in terms of achieving the goal for education, for instance, or the goal for gender equality or health, or reduce inequality or achieve peace and inclusive societies. These are all national obligations that member states have signed on to. Political obligations, of course, you have the whole human rights framework that I'm sure you're well aware of. So this guidance is updated within that context to take into account member states' recent and updated and old agreements in terms of ensuring how can we make sure that young people have the rights, they can realize their rights in practice. Next one, please. So if we would look upon what is comprehensive sexuality education, I'm just going to read this. It's always a discussion about what is the definition and what's behind it and what's inside it. So this is how we define comprehensive sexuality education broadly amongst the UN partners. A curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about the cognitive, emotional, physical and social aspects of sexuality. It aims to equip children and young people the knowledge, skills, attitudes and values that will empower them to realize their health, well-being and dignity, develop respectful social and sexual relationships, consider how their choices affect their own well-being and that of others, and understand and ensure the protection of their rights throughout their lives. So this is a very long sentence, but it captures the essence of what are the core values that we would like to emphasize in the guidance. How can we ensure that young people will have the knowledge, capacities and attitudes discussed within the framework of comprehensive sexuality education? And of course, if we look upon the contents, I'm going to wrap up. We see, of course, there are different levels. Why comprehensive sexuality education is called comprehensive. So of course it addresses the knowledge in terms of addressing the physical aspect, puberty, reproduction, menstruation, how to prevent HIV, but also the analytical skills and communication skills to ensure that you have respectful relationships that would implement the human rights and gender equality perspectives in practice. How do you do that? But of course also to provide tools in terms of knowing where to turn to when you're not able to practice those rights in practice. So if you're in a situation where you find yourself being harassed or bullied in school, or if you notice gender-based violence, or to discuss harmful practices such as child and early forced marriage, this is also something that's included in the guidance. My colleague from WHO will also talk about, of course, more the evidence, practical health outcomes in terms of CEC. But I can just, if you can just click quickly, we have, and you will see when you read the guidance, which I hope you all will do, it's comprehensive because it contains many different parts, both in terms of content, in terms of new recommendations. But one key point I think to point to from UNESCO is to really anchor this in terms of evidence-based information. What is it that we know works for young people? What is it that we can technically recommend member states to include based on evidence, based on research, based on best practices? And of course we know that comprehensive sexuality education will and have had positive effects in terms of increasing young people's knowledge about sexual and reproductive health. It does not increase sexual activity. That's sometimes a myth that it would encourage young people to start having sex. We see the other way around, that it will reduce numbers of partners, it will delay sexual debut when people have the knowledge and power to decide for themselves what they want to do. Also that abstinence only is proven to not be effective. That's also important for us to point to. How can we support member states with the right tools and recommendations for them to ensure the best health of young people? Of course, gender equality is a key element, and it's important for CEC to be comprehensive in order to be effective, and also be complementary with health services that young people need. So it's not a solution, but it will increase, of course, knowledge on where to seek services and to know how to prevent unwanted pregnancy and complete school, for instance. And you see all the different health effects that WHO will talk about. So with that, I just would like to thank you all and leave the word to Kate.
No, Karin, thank you so much. And I'm just keen that people can ask you questions. That's why I'm being rudely putting you under pressure in terms of timing. But colleagues, I think it's important that what we've heard is a multi-mandated cooperation in taking us forward into a new version of the technical guidance, that this guidance is rooted in science, it's based in evidence, not opinion, and it is normatively framed. And in that it's a great gift, but it won't mean much if we don't implement the thing and understand how best to implement it. And that's why I'm so pleased to have Avni Amin with us here from WHO. She is an expert in this intersection between gender equality, violence, and steps that we can take to prevent circumstances in which young women in particular are put in precarious situations with regards to the most intimate of rights. She's led the publication on clinical guidance for things such as child and adolescent sexual abuse, and WHO's plan of action on violence against women and girls and children. Avni, righto, so what? I mean, it's just another book. So what?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Karin. So I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 things. The first is, why do we need CSC? And I hope we don't have to spend a lot of time making the case for it, but just maybe look at some of the data. What does it really mean to have human rights-based approach to designing and executing or implementing CSC? What do we know about implementing CSC from countries, some of the challenges that countries have faced and how they've dealt with it? And then finally, just a little bit on holding duty bearers accountable to this. To give credit where it's due, the presentation is based on what my colleague Dr. Chandramouli has prepared, as he is the lead expert in this area in our department. So in a way, I'm just a messenger. But I will maybe ground some of these concepts in my own personal experience of having grown up in India with 0 sexuality education, and confronting as a mother of an 11-year-old who is just beginning to get sex education in the Swiss school systems, and how important I think this is. So next slide, please. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on the data, but I do think it's important to just dwell on some of the statistics that we all are familiar with. In many settings, menstruation and the onset of menstruation is really shrouded with silence. And so what we know is that in many settings, 2 out of 3 girls report having no idea what was happening to them when they began menstruating. We all know about the pregnancy and childbirth complications being the second leading cause of death among 15 to 19-year-olds. We all know about the data on experience of sexual violence among girls, and we also know about the lack of knowledge on HIV prevention and transmission. Next slide. Can you read any of those cartoon words? Okay. Well, anyway, I apologize, but basically what they're showing is a reality that young people face today in terms of the knowledge that they get about sex and sexuality. And to make this really real, I want to tell you about what I went through when I was 11. I came home from sports day, white shorts, started my periods, had no idea what happened to me. So I go home and I tell my aunt, you know, I fell down, or actually no, I don't know how this happened. I didn't really fall down, but something's wrong with me. And all I was told is, well, now you're a woman, here's the pad. You cannot talk about this with anyone. And basically, you have to sit with your legs crossed all the time. This was the sex education or the menstrual hygiene explanation that I got as an 11-year-old. There was no discussion about sex or consent or anything to do with reproduction. At home, in school, the only thing I was told is this is how babies are made, but you cannot have sex until you get married. So this was 1980s. I'm not sure things have changed that much for kids in schools in India, maybe in some schools, but probably not that much beyond what I knew. So I was pretty determined that this is not going to be what my daughters faced, right? So what does it mean then to think about what girls and children and boys should be learning about sex education today from a rights-based framework? And I'm so glad that Karin introduced the new technical guidance and highlighted the emphasis on a rights-based approach to sexuality education. Next slide, please. And some of the concepts that are articulated in much more detail in this new technical guidance really have to do with the importance of a positive approach to sexuality, the importance of promoting gender equality, the critical thinking skills that young people need to have, the importance of developing the skills to be assertive, negotiate, and communicate their needs, and for empowerment of young people to take responsibility for their own decisions and behavior. So this is what is in the guidance, but again, to ground it in a very real way with what my daughter is learning in school, in the Swiss school system today. So at age 8, parents were invited to have a conversation that the children were going to be taught about sex education. It's called l'histoire de la vie. And we were told what they're going to be taught. And what was important in that was that they were going to be taught from a very young age about consent. My body is mine and nobody touches it without my permission. And likewise, I don't touch anyone without their permission. And then of course, how babies are made and the usual stuff about sex and reproduction, they are beginning to start learning. And so they encourage parents to talk about it with their kids. So my daughter comes home one day and says, I know how babies are made. And I said, oh, okay, let's hear about it. And she said, well, the boy's sperm goes into the girl's egg, and then things multiply, and the baby, voila, comes out of the Virginia.
Virginia.
So this is what they're learning, which I have to say, I'm very happy. As a mother, I know she's getting the right information at the right time to make the right choices and the right decisions as she gets older. So moving then from the personal to the political, next slide please. What do we know about how countries are struggling to deliver CSC at scale and with quality and equity? Next. And what we're learning from examples such as Pakistan, Nigeria, Zambia, Estonia is the importance of 5 things. One is the importance of placing CSC on the national agenda, the importance of planning for scale up from the very beginning, the importance of managing scaling up of CSC effectively and efficiently, building support and anticipating backlash, and safeguarding sustainability. And I'm not going to cover all 5 points, but just a couple of points. Next. So let's take the case of Nigeria and how it placed CSC on the national agenda. Next. So what Nigeria did over a period of 8 years was persistent and strategic advocacy, where the NGOs first demonstrated the feasibility and usefulness of sexuality education. They then made a national coalition to advocate for a national policy and strategy on sexuality education. They formed a coalition that worked with both internal and external change agents to contribute to the development of a policy and a scale-up plan. So this is what took them 8 years, but again, this is sometimes how long it takes to get this on the national scale. I'm done, almost. No. Next slide, please. Then there is a case of Pakistan, which faced a lot of resistance while implementing the scaling up of sexuality education. And this is an NGO, Ahang, with the Rutgers NGO, where what they had to do was strategically build community support, choosing which issues to address, making sure that the sensitive content was vetted, and then actively reaching out to explain what they were doing. Of course, they encountered backlash from the political parties. So they then went into they retreated for a couple of years, but they didn't just say, okay, this is it, stop. What they did was they planned to counter the backlash by using supportive media persons as intermediaries, arranging for journalists to go to school to tell positive stories of how and what children were learning, and then organizing information sharing and discussions. And then they came back a few years later and were able to move forward in a much more productive way. Next. So I'm just going to end with this idea that we are now at a stage where we have the tools, we have political commitment in some quarters. This is a quote from the Ministers of Education and Health from 20 countries in East and Southern Africa, and we have the SDGs. And so we have no more excuse. We just need to move ahead. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Avni, and I think on behalf of everybody, we want to thank your daughter, too, for the clarity with which that she has provided us all about the important role that Virginia plays in comprehensive sexuality education. Fantastic, and we deeply appreciate WHO's persistence through you and through Chandramuli and his leadership for insisting that ministries of health around the world engage with these things and are brave and forthright as they do so. Which leads me to Makeda Zut. Oh, there's an A. God, Makeda Zut. I'm so sorry, Makeda, you'll introduce yourself far better than me, but you are from Action Canada.
Yes.
For sexual health and rights. You've been involved in creating and delivering something called Beyond the Basics. It's a lived example of what we're talking about. Welcome to Geneva. Great to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And it's an honor to be on this panel with my colleagues from the WHO and UNESCO. So I'm going to talk about the Canadian context and what Action Canada is doing to support the implementation of comprehensive sexuality education. So in Canada, we have progressive legal frameworks that enshrine and protect human rights at both national and provincial levels. However, even with these progressive legal frameworks, we still struggle with STI rates, sexual and gender-based violence, cyberbullying, and other forms of online harassment, and health services that don't always adequately address the needs of young people. So we know that overall health and well-being cannot be separated from sexual health and well-being. We also know that CSE, when effectively delivered and supported by policy and legal frameworks, has the potential to build skills that will be relevant to youth for the rest of their lives. So CSE is one crucial piece of a coordinated approach to prevent negative health outcomes. Yet despite the evidence supporting it, the implementation of CSE in Canada is often uneven. In some areas it's very out of date and sometimes non-existent. So part of these challenges stem from the fact that there are no national accountability mechanisms to assure that CSE curriculum content, delivery, and teacher training happening at the provincial level meets either national or international best practices and standards, as outlined in documents like the UNESCO guidelines and the Canadian Sexual Health Education Guidelines, which are currently in the process of being updated. Another challenge is that for folks that know Canada even a little bit, the physical geography is quite vast, with population being concentrated in major city centers, which also happen to be the economic hubs of the country. And there tends to be a concentration of services and resources within these urban centers, including access to specialized teacher trainings that are necessary for effective implementation of CSE. So for instance, in some of the more under-resourced provinces and territories, CSE becomes less of a priority in terms of teacher training than, say, subjects like math or science. So without a priority on implementation and the financial resources and policy support to make this implementation possible, it doesn't happen, or it happens in a piecemeal way. So what can we do to address some of these challenges? And what does Action Canada do specifically to address these challenges? Multi-pronged approaches that help create change at both the individual and structural levels are needed. So as an organization, Action Canada targets both of these levels to leverage opportunities to improve health outcomes for marginalized populations, including youth. So it's important to have both structural and individual level strategies, because structural and policy change can be slow in how it filters down to the people whose lives it's meant to affect. And so Action Canada not only focuses on engaging governments and policy leaders, but has also created resources meant to support sexual health educators on the ground and in practice. So one of these resources that we've created, and our sort of main resource, is called Beyond the Basics. And I wish we had copies here today to show you all, but unfortunately my bag has been lost in transit with the copies. So you can come find me. I'll be here for a couple of days if you want to look. We hope that the bag will arrive tomorrow.
Just a theory.
So Beyond the Basics targets, as I said, individual level change by building educators' capacity to effectively deliver CSE within classrooms. So specifically, the goal of Beyond the Basics is to equip educators with the skills, confidence, and knowledge to affect change in the lives of the young people that they work with. So this is the third edition of Beyond the Basics that we've produced, and with the third edition we saw a need to provide updated information that spoke to the context of young people's lives at this particular moment in time. So we wish to be responsive and dynamic in the face of evidence showing what impactful CSE curricula looks like and what studies are telling us about those receiving and teaching sex ed. So, for instance, research shows that young people want to learn the skills to engage in and maintain healthy, satisfying, mutually respectful relationships. And we also know from studies done that young people want sex ed that is LGBTQI inclusive. And in addition to this, we also know that educators are nervous and hesitant to teach these very topics that young people want to learn about, and they cite lack of knowledge, skills, confidence, and comfort in being able to deliver this information. We also recognize that with advances in digital and communication technologies, young people have access to more information than previous generations, and they're digesting it at a much faster pace, but don't necessarily inherently have the skill set to critically reflect on and make decisions about what they're seeing and how they're engaging online. We also wanted a resource that reflected advances made in the social discourse within Canada and elsewhere on gendered and sexual violence and on the challenging of gender norms and creating cultures of consent and challenging misogyny, challenging gender-based degradation, that kind of thing. So finally, while previous editions of Beyond the Basics did address some of the unique needs of LGBTQ young folks, it did not integrate this information in a holistic way. So given the statistics on negative health outcomes of LGBTQ youth in Canada, we felt it was extremely important that the third edition not only be inclusive and sort of add information here and there about LGBTQ identities and experiences, but that it was integrated throughout the resource in a way that aligned with human rights values of universality, inclusion, participation, non-discrimination, and equality. So speaking of human rights values, we wanted to ensure that the third edition was solidly grounded in a human rights approach that matched the most updated international standards for CSE, like the UNESCO guidelines. And grounding it in this approach, we were able to not only provide a framework and reasoning for why LGBT inclusion, challenging of gender norms, teaching of healthy relationships, all of that was important and necessary to include, but also we wanted to address the structural factors that impact young people's health. So in Beyond the Basics, we provide educators with the tools to empower young people as human rights advocates, and in this way, both educators and students can learn how to challenge the structural factors that impede positive health outcomes. Another thing that we did was that CSE international best practice really is clear that in order to ensure that curriculum content reflects the local realities where program implementation occurs, there needs to be community consultation. So it's one of the most effective ways to ensure that curriculum content will resonate and be relevant to the intended audience. And we did this with Beyond the Basics. We actually consulted educators, LGBTQ youth, and doctors. And I won't go into necessarily the specifics, but I will just say some cross-cutting lessons learned is that we really, when engaging community, you need to allow for the time to incorporate their feedback in a meaningful way. because that's the best way that it will actually impact the people that you want it to impact. And if your program does impact youth, which CSE always does, involve youth. So in conclusion, so Beyond the Basics and resources like it cannot exist on their own. Really, the potential for change for such resources cannot be achieved if states don't offer comprehensive solutions that include both policy and financial resources to address the limited or uneven access of high-quality comprehensive sex ed, and caused by outdated and limited curricula, lack of support for consistent and high-quality delivery, and the lack of evaluation, information gathering, and accountability measures in all those areas. So the role of states is that they need to ensure they're taking leadership on the strengthening of standards for what needs to be included in curriculum. And the role of advocates like Action Canada is to really ensure that states, and particularly in the case of Beyond the Basics and the CSE work we're doing in Canada, is ensuring that Canada follows through on its commitment to human rights.
Thank you. Fantastic, Makeda. Thank you so very much, and I'm sorry that time was not our friend in that regard, but I hope we can leave your last slide up because I think it's a fantastic and core message, because it is about the context in which comprehensive sexuality education is delivered, and the note you've struck on participation of those whom it's intended to benefit is absolutely key. So, colleagues, the reason I was pressing us was simply to open the floor and to allow you to interact with these fantastic, inspiring experts on a critical intervention. And I want to go first. Please do signal to me if you want to speak. I'm just going to go first to our wonderful, distinguished representative of Uruguay, who has been co-sponsored this event. Uruguay, please. Thank you.
where they can access very friendly information, where they can go to seek for help or information. So this is a way also, I think that we have to make use of technology in order to give the opportunity to children to access this information, not only through the formal system, but also through other kinds of means. And we are also very happy because we have recently, in December last year, adopted a new law, a very comprehensive law on violence against women, based on gender violence, and that has also a lot of articles dedicated to children and adolescents. And it's very comprehensive law that try to give some hints on how public policies in all the fields have to deal with the
Thank
issue
you.
of violence. And so we believe that hopefully we will be in a better situation in a couple of years.
Thank you so very much, including for the generous support of this event and for the leadership and example that Uruguay is setting. It's fantastic. So I just want to get some more voices around the table. Please introduce yourself. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Parra. I'm Advocacy Director at CRIA. I'm speaking on behalf of the Sexual Rights Initiative. And I wanted to highlight a specific, the need for comprehensive sexuality education with a disability rights perspective. In particular, four concrete points are that people with disabilities face particular harmful practices related to sexuality that should be accounted for in the mainstream narrative about what those harmful practices are, including forced and coerced sterilization and contraception, delay of menstruation and surgeries to facilitate handling, quote unquote, of people with disabilities. And the other thing is that information is not made accessible for people with disabilities, and we hope that the technical guide is translated into accessible formats for people with disabilities. The other point that I want to make that is crucial is that people with disabilities are systematically excluded from formal education systems, and although general education laws usually mandate the formal education system to include sexuality education, many people with disabilities live in facilities and institutions to which those laws do not apply, and therefore they don't access this kind of information. And finally, just to highlight that the stereotypes and stigma about sexuality of people with disabilities result in the systematic denial of comprehensive sexuality education that is tailored to the specific experiences of people with disabilities, and issues like sexual assistance and information about relations and sexuality are structurally denied.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Of critical importance. UNFPA, please. Alfonso.
Thank you, Kate. No, actually, because precisely we were with CREA side events before we were dealing with this issue, and I think in order to illustrate the magnitude of the issue, it's important to remind ourselves that there are 200 million children with disabilities in the world, and the level of violence that these children are exposed to is enormous. According to the latest data we shared at the event, from 4 to 7 girls with disabilities will experience violence before they reach the age of 18 out of 10, 4 to 8 out of 10, and in the case of boys is 2 to 3 out of 10. No, so definitely all the points that were raised by the colleagues from CREA are very important, and precisely in UNFPA we are working in that direction, also through peer support, from persons with disabilities to persons with disabilities, mindful that out of the school education is fundamental. So we really hope that these materials can be made available in accessible formats for different audiences. The same goes when we talk about out-of-school substance education. This is the area where UNFPA is in particular contributing to the rollout of the guides. The one question I have for the group is for the panelists, which you provide very rich presentations. One thing that we are noticing is how in different countries comprehensive sexuality education is applied with different terminologies. So what's your take on that is noticing that even countries that may not be so keen with the idea at political level are applying some form or some level of sexuality education, I think of the comprehensive out, but some form of with other terminologies. What would be the pros and cons of that approach?
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Any other comments or voices from the floor briefly as we conclude? Thank you very much, ma'am.
Sorry, my name is Diana. I work with the International LGBTI Association. I just wanted to congratulate you on the guidance. As I work on sexual orientation, gender identity expression, and sex characteristics issues, and as most of you have seen that there has been a crackdown on human rights on this specific issue in the Latin American countries, basically because of sex education, for us it's important to see how these guidance includes sexual orientation, gender identity expression, and also sex characteristics, which is very important too. And also because in one part of the guidance I was reading that despite that these might be difficult topics to discuss due to cultural or traditional issues, your recommendation is still to approach them because it's the only way to tackle these issues. And we have seen in countries such as Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, how the issue of including, of having an inclusive sex education, has become problematic when we talk about SOGIESC issues. So having such document is important when working or advocating for SOGIESC issues.
Thank you. I'm being ruthless on it because we've got a queue at the door and so we have to vacate, but I want to go back to the panelists, if you don't mind. Dear colleagues, we've heard three important messages. One about intersectionality, and we'd like to understand that both from a standpoint of disability and LGBTI. The second thing, we've heard about so-called sensitive issues. I'd be very interested in your answer to the question that was asked on abortion. Okay, there wasn't a question asked. That was oh, come on, work with me. Where does abortion and access to safe abortion fit in your messages? And thirdly, what's in a name? Does it matter what this is called? Does it really matter that it's called Histoire de Vie in Switzerland as opposed to comprehensive sexuality education, which is the Australian version? Please. Please, Karin, please.
Thank you very much for excellent questions. In terms of the terminology, I think within the guidance, when you read it, we have also stressed the importance that the content is comprehensive. And sometimes that could be forgotten if you just address certain elements of comprehensive sexuality education. It's called different things in different countries, but we would really like to underline to really look upon the content, and that's the comprehensiveness of it, including addressing different topics, including addressing the questions that young adolescents have for themselves, as the delegate from Uruguay pointed out, the importance of including and listening to young people. Also in terms of how can we stress the importance of non-discrimination and non-violence and creating environments of non-bullying regardless of your sexual orientation, gender identity, expression or characteristics. So that is included in the technical guidance with clear human rights references. But of course it's always situated in a national context and the way that you talk about it is always different. But we have the clear UN mandate to point to the international agreements, to point to the evidence-based information of what could be supportive, and of course address what young people need answers to and what they face in their everyday life. So that is included.
Thank you, Karin. Avni, come on.
I'll make your job easy and just say Karin said it all.
Oh,
no, I'm conscious of the time, but I would agree because with the terminology, just to flag, I think the content is more important and countries have called it different things.
Thank you, and Makita, please.
I think that Karin said it all as well. I mean, I'm not. We definitely, in Beyond the Basics, take an intersectional approach, and we also include all pregnancy options. With that's in line with the human rights framework as well, talking about all the options that are available to folks in Canada. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that time has not been with us, but thank you for your kind consideration. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel and the inspirational their examples. Please note, at the heart of this, it is our duty and our obligation to talk with our children about everything. And when we create silence over issues critical to rights and to dignity, we are on the wrong side of their interests, and certainly in this case on the wrong side of history. We look to your support and your advocacy for this important work. You have the gift of the guidance, the wonder of the example locally, the assurance that it's technically and scientifically sound. On we go to greater promulgation. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's the evening.
Thank you.
I don't have much time to play with. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. I wonder, we might take a picture with everybody if that. Okay, we're just going to take a picture.